story you're about to hear is Afro-futuristic science fiction. Even though actual names and events are referenced, it is a work purely out of my imagination. My name is Mark Gunn, and I'm the author of what you are about to hear. This story is set in Africa and employs the use of several different languages in the names of the chapters. Translation is provided within the story in order for you to see the significance of each chapter name. Enjoy.
Baraaruga The Awakening by Mark E. Gunn. Originally published April 12, 2017. Copyright Mark Gunn Media Incorporated. Forward. Set in the not-too-distant future, this story illustrates the consequences of an apathetic and easily manipulated population. In an effort to make America great again, such apathy leads to a world where the United States as we know it no longer exists, and the problems of the past, having never been resolved, continue to plague a nation living in denial. The old expression, "Those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it," has come to pass, and change has come to America, but not for the better. Luckily, another old expression, "and the children shall lead them," comes to fruition, giving America hope and an opportunity to save itself from the politics of self-destruction.
Chapter 1. How We Got Here. The year is 2038. 10 years ago, American democracy was completely done away with by what we've come to know as the administration. By some bizarre confluence of events that appeared to be straight out of Adolf Hitler's playbook, and a voting populace that pretty much fell for every racist, sexist, and xenophobic rant uttered by then-candidate Donald Trump. He was elected as the 47th President of the United States. Due to the Republican Party's systematic dismantling of the Constitution and constant gerrymandering, Americans lost. No, more like gave up most of their rights. To this day, they still think that Trump made America great again. 2024 would be the last year a free and fair election was ever held. You pretty much know about the first 4 years. Yeah, I know. Who knew he'd actually last that long? Scandals, pissing off allies, a revolving door of trolls, that disastrous tax reform of 2017, and the big beautiful bill of 2025, of course. The endless wars against countries that were once allies and alliances with those that were once enemies. Trump was a major factor in the wars between Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Palestine. Because of his actions and those of Vladimir Putin and Benjamin Netanyahu, close to 43 million men, women, and children were murdered. Remember the whole Russia investigation? Turns out that there actually was collusion between members of the campaign and the Kremlin. Several upper-level administration officials were indicted and ended up working with the investigation. Once Americans started turning up either dead or missing, nothing was ever heard about it ever again.
The lead investigator for the FBI, Robert Mueller, vanished without a trace. He was found a couple of years later, buried underneath the giant FBI logo on the floor of the Bureau's lobby when the agency was disbanded and the building demolished. As some sort of sick, twisted joke, his mouth was stuffed with a bunch of Russian rubles. Trump loyalist and Bureau director J. Edgar Hoover IV was said to have been responsible, but it was never proven. These days we see a lot more of Vladimir Putin roaming around the White House. Mar-a-Lago East. 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue was sold in a land-grabbing scheme back in 2026 as a celebration of that year's midterm elections being abolished. Mar-a-Lago East now stands in its place. We all knew that Donald Trump wasn't bright enough to pull off all of the scams done in the name of the American people on his own. The real power was in the hands of the administration. Stephen Miller, longtime Trump aide who got the gig by having Chief of Staff Reince Priebus deported, even though he was an American citizen, was long believed to be the one behind all of Trump's actions. I still can recall Miller's interview shortly after Trump's election when he said that
the powers of the president were absolute and would not be questioned.
We dismissed him as a smarmy little troll back then. Big mistake. Jefferson Beauregard Sessions,
the Attorney General who single-handedly set back police reform and civil rights over 100 years, was convicted of lying to Congress and pardoned by Trump within minutes of the conviction. One of Sessions' proudest moments came as he successfully repealed the 5th and 13th Amendments of the Constitution. He spent the last few years going after and jailing the descendants of Martin Luther King Jr. Seems he was still miffed about that letter that Coretta Scott King wrote about him back in the 80s. You see, he was deemed to be too racist to ever be appointed to a federal judgeship. Mrs. King's letter played a big role in his not getting the job. Thanks to Sessions, politicians can literally get away with murder, and Jim Crow 2.0 is now the law of the land. Simply being black in America is hazardous to your health, especially since white supremacist groups like the KKK, the Proud Boys, and Patriot Front were made agents of the state.
Finally, Ivanka Trump, the one person able to keep her dad in line when he went off the deep end. One of the first things she did was to have Melania and Barron shipped off to God knows where. Seems that Mrs. Trump forgot that she was merely eye candy to the president and started demanding to be treated like the First Lady. And her son? According to Ivanka, Barron was too much of a liability after the 5th or 6th kidnapping attempt by resistance fighters. You see, the president was diagnosed as being mentally unstable back in 2019, and Big Pharma developed medication to counteract the effects. By the way, the actual cure was developed back in 2003, but you know how corporate greed works. Control the disease instead of cure it, in order to affect the profit margin. Democrats tried and failed on numerous occasions to have him removed from office by invoking the 25th Amendment, but could never get the votes needed. The consequences for their families ended up being too grave, so they never tried again. The speeches the president gives are nothing short of a Big Brother-esque display that would have made Kim Jong-un blush were he still alive. Seems he had the nerve to beat Trump in a round of golf, and he was murdered because of it. When Trump speaks, you're really hearing the words of the administration. You would think that after all these years, the president would have learned to read beyond a 5th grade level. Some things never change. During the administration's reign, black people existed in a dystopian landscape that would make Orwell's 1984 fantasy seem like paradise. You know the expression, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer? Under Trump, blacks didn't get richer. We saw our fortunes confiscated under new corporate tax rules. The poor paid taxes through forced labor. Slavery made a huge comeback at the end of 2026. Because of Jim Crow 2.0, every bit of progress blacks had made was slowly erased. Every civil right our ancestors fought and died for, gone. Every reform designed to address years of racist mistreatment, done away with as if it never existed. We essentially had no rights in America. Gangs of Trump's so-called national police force, his brown shirts, would patrol the streets. I saw friends and relatives randomly beaten or killed on the spot under the breathing while black provision of the Papers, Please law. This was legislation that came out of Arizona back in the late 2000s. It failed because it was decided back then that you shouldn't have the ability to question someone's citizenship during a stop by the police. It was deemed unconstitutional. Not anymore in 2038. After years of very careful planning and pooling of what resources we had left, the Garvey Initiative was born. Inspired by Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement of the mid-20th century, some of us chose to leave America and go home. Chapter 2. Kupanda Mbegu, Sowing the Seeds. This is where my story begins. My name is Dr. Malcolm Marcus Yazazi. Yes, my namesakes are those two iconic civil rights figures, Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey. My parents knew something that I wouldn't come to know until later in life. A geneticist by trade and a social justice warrior out of necessity. Long before the administration came into power, I was a fighter. Books, lectures, and most importantly, being on the ground with my people, fighting to end racism. Needless to say, success has been very limited. Over the years, I've been able to network with some of the most brilliant black minds on the planet.
I'd always lamented the fact that as a people, we had a tendency to turn our noses up at black intelligentsia and always gravitated to the slick-talking preacher. Part of our mistake was in a reliance on the past. We clung to the ways of Dr. King and the various wannabes that would assume to replace him as black moral leadership. And over time, they would be found out as frauds and summarily dismissed. We were looking for someone to lead us when we should have been relying on ourselves. You can only bang your head against a wall so many times. The frustration was unbearable. It was because of that and the ongoing injustice happening in America that I chose to come home. Africa. I was in my 20s when I started doing some research, focusing on genetic differences between blacks here and in America. I wanted to know how environmental conditions and other factors affected our DNA on a generational level. What effect did over 400 years of slavery have on us? And what were the lasting consequences? My findings have been published in several scientific journals throughout the world, but banned in the States because they were seen as subversive and a threat to the New World Order established there. Just as in centuries past, America continues to have a real problem being called out on her original sin. It was then that a bit of self-discovery would change my life forever. I ran the same tests on myself and my parents, using the exact same protocols, family origin being the first. I discovered that we were the direct descendants of Lucy, the very proof that all life began in Africa. Back in the 20th century, 1974 to be exact, a group of paleontologists were in Ethiopia when they discovered her remains. She was given the name Lucy because one of them, a doctor, Donald Johansen, had an old-fashioned music device, a cassette by a group called the Beatles. There was a song called Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Someone suggested the name and it stuck. I was able to get a lot of other basic information during my research, but there were some gaps that only my parents could fill. The most important discovery being that we were a part of Lucy's original bloodline. One of the traditions we hold dear is that of storytelling. Our true history is handed down from generation to generation. Because of that, I learned a lot more than the scientists who discovered Lucy. For instance, her actual name was Ukufila, which loosely translates to life. Her exact birthplace remains unknown, but over the course of a few hundred years, she came to be known as Lewe, Haya, and Nolosha, to name a few. The further I dug, the more overwhelmed I became. Ancient language and writing systems, sciences, and tons of other history that remained hidden from those outside of the original family. It would take several years of study before I gained a full understanding of who I was and why I existed. I amassed a global network of scientists and researchers with the goal of ending the suffering of black people. That network extended to business leaders and politicians who were selected on the basis of DNA testing. Every member of what we called the Baraaruga had a direct genetic connection to Ukufila. We developed cures for heart disease, sickle cell, hypertension, and a host of illnesses that were more problematic for us. We spread our cures through the network, and millions of lives were saved. However, we had no such connection to America, and they were the ones that needed it the most. In my mind, they needed something much more. They needed freedom, and I set out on a mission to deliver it. In the here and now, the cancer that was the administration got worse. Blacks were no longer the exclusive victims of their hatred and vitriol. I found out that there were pockets of resistance, which was unusual since the First Amendment was the first thing to be abolished. An assassination attempt was made on the life of Stephen Miller, but it failed. Because of that, anyone who wasn't white now fell under Jim Crow 2.0, and the cruelty displayed was reminiscent of the worst slave masters. White supremacist groups now made up the National Guard under the direction of Attorney General Sessions. The beatings and murders increased exponentially. Slaves were now being leased to Big Pharma for testing of new drugs.
Since regulations had been removed, it didn't matter if they survived the trials.
Over the next 2 years, the administration would try to realize its dreams of global dominance. This was made easier with Putin's Russia being a willing ally. Countries that left the European Union back in 2016 had no choice but to be annexed because, in the years following their moment of extreme xenophobia, their economies crumbled. European leaders were killed on live television. When Queen Elizabeth was beheaded, England fell in line like the rest. Meanwhile, I continued my work in formulating a plan to help my brothers and sisters in America. The Baraaruga continued its global expansion by adding more family members. We sought military strategists, economists, and teachers. It was understood that, if we were going to be liberators, we'd have to take a multi-level approach. There was one more piece to the puzzle, and it was soon to come. Chapter 3. Isipo, the Gift. As the tragic events in America continued to unfold, attempts at gaining freedom were becoming more frequent. While they hadn't been able to kill anyone from the administration, lower-level cabinet members were targeted. White nationalist Steve Bannon, once the head of the Security Council, had been shown the door by General Mattis back in 2017. Bannon was then appointed as the National Media Czar. With the Federal Communications Commission gone, all radio and television stations fell under his control. The last few newspapers were shut down because Trump didn't like to read, and internet use eliminated. The dissemination of ideas not approved by the administration became a capital offense. Television news as we knew it was destroyed. News personalities that Trump didn't like were exiled or killed. Liberal voices, Anderson Cooper, Joy Ann Reid, and Rachel Maddow, all gone. Some conservatives at Fox News that fell out of favor with Trump were shown the door. Speaking of Fox, the only ones left were their laughable excuse of a morning show, Fox and Friends, and Sean Hannity, who was made head of the network by presidential appointment. There was no such thing as a free and independent press anymore. Bannon's job was to continue to spoon-feed the citizens the all is well, nothing to see here message. What he'd been able to do was incorporate a practice that was outlawed in the 1970s. He brought back subliminal messaging designed to keep whites thinking that they were superior and that the treatment of blacks and other people of color was perfectly justified, the high-tech version of the Southern strategy. Bannon was a creature of habit. He would go to the old offices of Breitbart News every day at 2 p.m. For some reason, only known to himself, no one else would be in the building at that time. Maybe it was his attempt at being seen as a good boss by letting the staff knock off that early. Ironically, the Breitbart building exploded on March 1st, 2029, 9 years to the day that Andrew Breitbart, the original founder, died. Sessions investigated, but the culprit was never found. Here at home, my team and I developed the means of black liberation. It was another gift of sorts from our dear mother Nubia, Ukupila. While researching my family tree, I learned several crucial things about black DNA. Thanks to the remains of our dear Ukupila, we discovered that the original man was indeed genetically superior to those that came after him. I had a team of linguists translate some of Mother Nubia's writings, and she spoke of her children having the strength of 20 men and boundless intelligence. There was an old TV sportscaster named Jimmy the Greek Snyder, who was fired from CBS for saying that blacks were basically bred to be physically superior. You couldn't say things like that on television because it was seen as racist. There were ancient mathematical equations that would lead to some of our most important breakthroughs. Another aspect of our mission became to finally expose, in no uncertain terms, the lies told about blacks by the European world. Questions about our morality and intelligence would be put to rest once and for all. Our history would be made complete and 100% accurate. What would I do with this information? How can I use it to free my people? The answer would come from the mind of a child. During one of the many conferences we have with various African leaders, We check their progress on a lot of the initiatives used to improve life overall. We often exchange ideas, and children are encouraged to be a part of those discussions. The mindset being that these are our future warriors and leaders. Give them the building blocks of leadership early in life, and they'll transition into the leaders we need at the proper time. 12-year-old Prince Ikawe of Zimbabwe, who already had an uncanny grasp of the more complex aspects of science, asked about the possibility of returning our DNA to its original state by transmutation, giving us the physical and mental characteristics of our ancestors needed to overcome the American oppressors. Thoughts of the old Marvel comic book Captain America came to mind, with the whole origin story of how he was injected with a super soldier serum that altered his physique and gave him heightened abilities. His Highness, with the light of maturity far beyond his years, told me how silly that story was and left his father and I a little dumbfounded. Hey, we were comic book fans growing up. Sue me. Kids, don't make them like they used to. He was right about one thing, though. We need to go back in order to move forward. We spent the next few months developing and testing the formula that would end up being our ultimate weapon. We gave it the code name Mfuko. Meanwhile, there were reports of small chinks in the administration's armor. Several months after the Bannon assassination, tensions were beginning to mount between America and the Russians. It seems that Putin wanted more control than he had, and in light of his influence on the 2016 election, he was owed that much. The point of contention, once again, was Syria. Seems that President Assad had outlived his usefulness after gassing his own citizens a few years back. This was a severe miscalculation on his part, because several assets were destroyed as well. A growing resistance was taking shape, and that couldn't be tolerated.
Putin had Assad killed. However, the administration replaced him with his daughter, who was just as sick and twisted as he was. She also had designs on the Kremlin. Needless to say, this didn't sit well with Vladimir. This was a fight that lasted the better part of the decade. What do you know? Mysterious deaths by poison. Russian and Syrian officials vanishing without a trace. The makings of another Cold War. Go figure. We were making progress, and the tests for Mfuko were successful. What we needed to do was to bind our formula to a very specific set of genetic markers, those belonging to Mother Nubia. The end result of what we called Operation Kabusha would be a natural immunity to all disease, an increase in height, muscle mass, strength, and an unlocking of all of the brain's quadrants, making the cerebral cortex fire on all cylinders. There would be one more gift that wouldn't be revealed until it was time. While preparations were being made, there was another aspect of the battle that was beginning to bear fruit. One of the things long hidden from American history until late in the 21st century was the list of companies that directly profited from slavery. Companies that have existed for hundreds of years and thought themselves absolved of any culpability. There were quite a few. Financial giant Lehman Brothers, who admitted their role in the slave trade. America's largest health insurer at the time, Aetna, who reimbursed slave owners for the losses after slavery was abolished. J.P. Morgan Chase, who talked about two of their predecessors accepting some 13,000 slaves as loan collateral. And menswear giant Brooks Brothers got its start by selling slave clothing to owners. These were but a few businesses that profited from bondage, but the ones we were specifically looking at were the linchpins to the American economy. The administration made financial institutions too big to fail, and boy, were they in for a very rude awakening.
Chapter 4. Safarka, The Journey. In the year and a half that passed since Operation Kabusha was finalized, the administration began to notice some anomalies in their revenue streams. You see, having learned the lessons of hundreds of years of fiscal recklessness, the administration and its financial network tracked every dollar down to the penny. The crash of 2007 was forever etched in their minds. In the rare event that revenues were off, forensic accountants would find the discrepancy and reconcile it. The penalty for the person that missed it in the first place was often being beaten and put on a work detail for 6 months. Since the only ones dealing with the money were white, death was rarely an option. These monetary missteps were, of course, being caused by the Baraaruga and served as a distraction for the next phase of our plan. The next step was to actually launch Operation Kabusha by getting the Mfuko formula to America. Thanks to the writings of Grand Nubia, we were able to develop technology far more advanced than anything seen on the planet. Technology that was thousands of years old. Planning the route and delivery method was fairly easy. We brought in a group of 8-year-old engineering students from Nairobi to plot the course and come up with a disbursement system. These kids came up with a two-pronged approach based on old-school nanotech and fiber optics. The difference was that while it had substance, it couldn't be seen or felt. They called it Okumdabona Kali, the unseen. The formula would be transmitted through the air and water, launched in its most concentrated form, and slowly dispersed once it reached America. One of the students, a Somali girl named Dirada, suggested sending it along the transatlantic slave route. While the irony of her suggestion wasn't lost on anyone, the route itself had to be slightly altered because there were so many different destinations during the original 5,000-mile journey. We focused on the original ports of entry: New Orleans, Louisiana, Charleston, South Carolina, and Richmond, Virginia. We then diverted the routes that went to Central and South America and Europe to the West Coast with various entry points throughout California. With the advent of our technology, it would reach the U.S. and Washington state. The trip would take mere nanoseconds. The way that led to our bondage over 400 years ago would now be the way to our salvation.
Chapter 5. Kuthielwe, delivered. April 4th, 2038. The date was very deliberately chosen. Those of you that study history will see its significance. It was exactly 1 second after midnight that Operation Kabusha was launched. Less than 1 second later, the Mfuko formula given to us by our mother, Grand Nubia, reached its destination: the United States of America. 2 seconds later, it began its mission of seeking out members of the original family through a very specific genetic code. We were able to calculate the number to 13,572,402 brothers and sisters. These would be the soldiers on the front line for liberation. The process would be subtle and take a few weeks. The Koiska, as they would come to be called, would slowly see and feel the changes within themselves. Their heightened intellect would let them know exactly what was happening. One of the gifts included within the formula was a subliminal set of instructions. Each member of the Koiska had specific tasks, and they would follow them to the letter in preparation for the next phase of our attack. I was able to follow the progress of my brothers and sisters, and they prepared to reach the peak of physical and mental perfection at the end of the process, men and women becoming the kings and queens they were always meant to be. June 19th, 2038. Another date deliberately chosen. History buffs will understand. Those members of the Koiska that were held as slaves began the process of grooming other brothers and sisters for battle through teachings of ancient African fighting techniques. These came before any other martial arts and were subsequently banned by the Western world because of their efficiency. They were taught how to still the mind and focus on their inner spirit. They were given something that in over 400 years, America had never given them: a spiritual link to the motherland. My other brothers and sisters executed their part of the plan by working their way through America's infrastructure. No institution would be safe. Media, financial and medical, all targets for what was to come. Meanwhile, here at home, the cyber attacks on the administration increased. Only this time, vast sums of money were disappearing without a trace. Forensic scientists couldn't make heads or tails of what was happening. A lot more people got hurt as a result. Some even killed. How do you think Stephen, Jeff, and Ivanka would react if they found out that they were being punked by a bunch of 7-year-olds? Man, I love kids. President Trump? From what I hear, he only makes an appearance once a year now. Seems Big Pharma cut off his meds when a deal fell through that cost them several billions. Trump just wanders around Mar-a-Lago with a golf club in his hand, drooling and looking for the putting green.
One of the things I learned from my parents is that sometimes you have to give people a false sense of security. It makes them sloppy and careless. And so, the cyber attacks ceased for a while, and the other work continues. Chapter 6. Impy, the Battle. It's been several months since Operation Kabusha began, and the results have been very promising. The administration continues to take financial losses it can't explain, not sitting too well with their allies. The Koiska has been successful in worming their way into the infrastructure, causing several mysterious events. The rolling blackouts in New York and Los Angeles last month were epic. Strange reports coming from Jeff Sessions' forces of blacks laughing in the faces of police officers when being beaten. 12 officers in Baltimore had their necks snapped. The state-run media is fighting a losing battle when it comes to keeping this information from the general populace. My sisters, tasked with shutting down the media, report that they're making progress. As we've seen over a period of months, more whites are starting to shake off the effects of the subliminal brainwashing they've been subjected to for years. Quite a few of them are innocent victims, so we have a directive that no harm shall come to them. One by one, the institutions that propped up America's racism are beginning to crack. Now is the perfect time to strike. Chapter 7. Kacha, Rise. Over the last few weeks, events in the United States have left their allies concerned. The administration is losing control of its people. Incidents of open rebellion and continued infighting between Miller, Sessions, and Trump. The last thing Putin needs is for this virus to spread and infect his people. He's still looking over his shoulder for the daughter of Assad, the Syrian president he murdered years ago. She's been consolidating power and has managed to bump off Putin's second-in-command. How can he deal with that and the problems in America? He won't have to for much longer. The Baraaruga has been successful in creating chaos in a once orderly world. Years of hard work and planning have come to this. Time for the rise of the original man once again. Our dear mother, Grand Nubia, the original giver of life, has provided everything we need to thrive once again as a civilization. Through her, Africa has been unified for decades, and we are the most technologically advanced nation on the earth. Through her, we've been able to get back to what we once were, the peak of human perfection. We've eliminated sickness, slowed down death, and unleashed the full potential of our minds. Now, after many years of watching my brothers and sisters in America suffer under the most vile and brutal regime in history, we bring all of that evil to an end. In the Mfuko formula we developed to restore our people to their true selves, there were several subliminal commands designed to trigger them into performing the tasks they were picked for. There was only one command left, the one word that set into motion a global chain of events that would change everything forever. That word, that one command, was to be given by the youngest of us. I said before that in this society, children were strongly encouraged to be a part of shaping its future, because it is indeed their future. Nkosazana is a 4-year-old warrior princess of the Zulu nation. Her family is a story in contradictions. The Zulus are among the deadliest fighters in the world, bar none. However, she has been one of the most effective symbols of peace in all of Africa. It was decided among the elders of other nations that she be the one to usher in this new era of profound change. She dons the headset and gives me a knowing look. At only 4 years of age, she has a keen understanding of what she is about to do. A hush falls over the command center as she gives me one more look.
She stares intently at the monitors in front of her and speaks.
Baraaruga!
Rise. With that one word, an incredible sight unfolds. All over America, the over 12 million members of the Koiska transform. They grew to stand at 7 feet 2 inches tall, with an average weight of 300 pounds of solid muscle. Their frames are suddenly clad in black uniforms of a unibody design, form-fitting from head to toe and designed for maximum flexibility. Their faces completely covered in a black mask with a design of a clenched fist, bearing the colors of the African flag, red, black, and green, and adorned with various symbols from the many tribes of the motherland. This scene is repeated all over the country at the same time. Sessions' white supremacy forces converge on each location, and as they stand ready to confront this new and unknown threat, the Koiska vanish, leaving the police staring into the angry eyes of those they've beaten and abused for years. This is when the training kicks in. The hunted become the hunters, and they've learned their lessons well. Very few of the officers escape with their lives. Thanks to the efforts of my sisters in sabotaging the media, scenes like this were broadcast all over the globe. Word of this reaches the administration, and the panic sets in. Ivanka tries to gain access to her funds. They're no longer there. The same goes for Miller and Sessions. They'll soon learn the fate of that money, and a few other things as well. 5 minutes after the Koiska vanished, several teams were transported to the various seats of the administration's power. At the exact same instant, Miller, Sessions, Trump, and Putin were surrounded by the massive black figures that appeared out of nowhere. They found the president yelling at a stuffed bobcat in the lobby. Calls to the military were to no avail. A series of EMPs rendered their equipment useless. Military leadership was rounded up and held in the Pentagon. Politicians who'd been deemed useless years ago when Trump was elected were also held. Any opposition to the Koiska was rendered helpless. Ordinary Americans, still coming out of their brainwashed, racist stupor, were confused and disoriented. They were advised to stay in their homes. The time for explanations was now, and I had one more trick up my sleeve. I consulted with a team of 16-year-old graphic designers who were doing some really incredible things with holograms. I wanted something very specific, something that would be an homage to my namesakes, Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X. They developed a holographic image that, through the use of high-frequency video swapping, would create rapidly alternating images of Malcolm and Marcus. Think of how the old internet Wi-Fi worked back in the day. The router would constantly change channels in an attempt to lock on to the strongest bandwidth possible at any given time. The voice was a synthesis of the speech patterns of both men as well. The students had a theory about the frequency of their voices being one of the reasons they were able to hold the attention of so many people during their lifetimes. In the midst of an eerie quiet, a silence so loud it was heard around the world, my hologram appeared. I began.
We are the Baraaruga. We are the original man. The black-clad men and women among you are my family. We are who we were always meant to be, the true rulers of this world.
I continued.
Here in America, you have continued a legacy of pure evil for well over 400 years. That ends today. Your sanctioning of the barbarism committed against black people and people of color will be dealt with here and now. Your chief law enforcement officer, Jefferson Beauregard Sessions, has abused his power for the last time, and there can be only one remedy for that.
I paused and nodded at the woman restraining Sessions. With a nod of acknowledgement, 1 second later, a loud snap. His neck was broken and he fell in a heap, dead, on the floor. After the shock of what had just happened wore off, I continued to speak.
Vladimir Putin, your brand of unspeakable evil has haunted your country for far too long. Too many have died by your hand because of your political ambitions.
With that, another member of the Koiska ushered in Madam President Assad, who raised a handgun, pointed it right between Putin's eyes, and pulled the trigger.
Her neck was also snapped a couple of seconds later. I finally addressed Stephen Miller and Ivanka Trump.
This country has always profited from the pain of its black citizens. There were some 15 American companies that made their money as a result of slavery. As of 2 minutes ago, those companies and your fortune no longer exist.
She and Miller looked as if they'd seen a ghost.
For hundreds of years, blacks in this country have been asking for reparations, and for hundreds of years, they've watched you pay every other group you've ever wronged, but not them. No matter. I had a team of 7-year-olds redirect every dime of profit those companies ever made. And after some rather extensive research, the money was paid to the descendants of those you've enslaved.
I stopped speaking long enough to let that soak in. Just as I thought, Stephen Miller looked like he could explode. Punked by a bunch of 7-year-olds. The look on his face alone was priceless.
You, Miss Trump, will be spared. Mr. Miller, on the other hand.
With that, he was strangled to death.
However, the remainder of your life will be spent in Guantanamo Bay. You remember that place, right? The prison your father wanted to keep open? You'll be put there to fend for yourselves, and if you try to escape, you'll be killed on the spot.
There was one last piece of business to tend to. The President of the United States. There were quite a few disagreements as to how to handle Donald Trump. It was suggested that since it was his racist, sexist, homophobic, and xenophobic vitriol that set this entire chain of events into motion, he should be killed. However, it took a child to remind us that mistreating our elders is not our way.
Speaking of your father, he can go to his heart's content because he'll be going with you. We've begun treatment to reverse the effects of his dementia because that's more humanity than the administration has ever shown. While his mind will be restored, he'll also have to live with the implanted memories of every evil he's ever perpetrated, including every person ever killed, directly or indirectly. He will surely be driven back to madness and may never be able to swing a golf club ever again.
With that, the Trumps were taken away. My final address was for the American people.
You were a nation of great promise and greater hypocrisy. Your hubris and arrogance cost you years of progress. You squandered precious resources, and because of your ignorance when it comes to innovation, the millions of jobs that could have been created in order to advance technologically never came to pass. You willingly allowed this country to become stuck on stupid, so the path you were on until now was inevitable. Your idea of democracy and freedom were always a sick joke that was never funny to the rest of the world. Your actions over the last several hundred years have had a negative effect on everyone you've touched. That ends right now.
With those words, my image vanished, and I could sense a whole new level of fear and a whole new level of hope. Epilogue. It's been 10 years since the awakening, and America is totally different from what she was. For the time being, there is no constitutional republic, no elections. The Baraaruga has made several appointments of regional leaders charged with working with representatives of various communities. America's ill-gotten gains have been stripped and treaties negotiated. 3 years ago, an agreement was made to return all of the land stolen from Native Americans. In exchange, they would become teachers, passing along their knowledge of holistic medicine and environmental science. America, like Canada, made racism a federal crime, and a slowly rebuilding media is now governed by the same truth in reporting standards used up north. The Koiska remains a constant presence not only here, but around the globe. Not as an occupying force, but as a reminder of who we are and what we're capable of. As for me, I'm watching the children that helped bring these changes about take their rightful place as leaders of this brave new world, and thinking of the woman who started it all, Mother Nubia, Ukupila, life.
This is Mark Gunn Media.
Hit it!